Anything from his testimony. We are joined now by Congressman Bruce Braley, who is vice chairman of the subcommittee that began the questioning of Mr. Hayward this morning. Congressman, do you feel like you know any more today than you, or this afternoon, I should say, than you did this morning?
I do, Dylan. I feel like we know that there's a huge disconnect between Mr. Hayward and BP's statements about their commitment to safety and what we know now is the reality of their very disturbing safety record.
What strikes you? Educate the rest of us. Where do you see the most glaring chasm between their words and rhetoric and their actual practices?
Well, Mr. Hayward has said over and over and over again that safety is the #1 priority of BP and has been in the last 3 years when he has been CEO. And yet when I confronted him with OSHA's findings that BP has 97% of the willful, egregious citations by OSHA out of all the refineries in this country, even though they only have 2, they have 97%, almost 760 citations for the worst citation on safety record that you can get from OSHA. He initially tried to indicate that that wasn't consistent with his statement, and then finally admitted that there's a huge disconnect between what he's saying and the reality of their corporate safety record.
And is your perception that that huge disconnect is unique to this company, or is more common or not less common in this industry?
Well, you know, we had the other CEOs testify yesterday in front of another subcommittee on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and they were very quick to condemn BP's safety record. And if you look purely at the OSHA citations out of the 55 refineries, the fact that 2 of them from BP make up 97% of these egregious willful findings, it certainly would suggest that from OSHA's standpoint, they are by far the worst offender.
If you were to look at the path forward from here, coming out of these hearings, what demonstrable action is even achievable in either the reform, in any category, from reform to plugging the well, from today's hearings?
Well, first of all, we have to realize that BP has a long way to go to improve its safety record and protect the lives of people in the future working on these rigs. We know they cut corners in the permitting process because they did not do an intensive environmental impact study. That's also on the shoulders of the Minerals Management Service, which allowed that to happen, even though they knew there was a 99% chance of a blowout occurring at this well over the 40-year period of this lease. So we have a responsibility to make sure that they are changing that corporate culture and living up to their commitment to these workers, like the 2 widows whose testimony I played during my opening statement.
Let's address the actual crisis as it continues to develop and expand today, as this testimony continues and everybody goes about their daily lives. To what extent was there a either conscious or negligent misrepresentation of the flow rate from this well in the first few weeks, either by BP or the government? And to what extent was the misrepresentation of the early flow rate directly determinative to our failure to have an early containment strategy for what is now obviously a massive geyser of oil in the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, I think from the standpoint of containment, from the standpoint of the public health response, that misrepresentation has had colossal negative implications for our response on a national level. We know that BP originally said that the leak was 1,000 barrels per day. Shortly thereafter, people monitoring the video said it had to be at least 5,000 barrels per day. At the end of May, it was upgraded to 12,000 to 19,000 barrels per day. And just this week, we're being told that it's as high as 60,000 barrels per day. That's 2.5 million gallons a day, Dylan, and that is an environmental and ecological catastrophe of the highest order.
And we have the same progression that you just referenced. We're going to talk about this with Matt Simmons in just a second, but how much responsibility for the misrepresentation of that flow rate, which is determinative to the response, because obviously the response to 1,000 or 5,000 gallons a day is very different from the response from 2.5 million gallons a day. How much responsibility lays at the foot of the White House for deferring to BP for these flow rate estimates and or confirming or participating with BP in planning based on these misrepresented flow rates?
Well, I think there's a lot of shared responsibility to go down, but I think BP bears the ultimate responsibility. They are the responsible party, and it's easy for us to be armchair quarterbacks and look at that TV monitor, Dylan, but I don't think either you or I has the technical expertise to tell definitively how much that was released based on a TV camera. Now I think we have a much better perception based upon more accurate monitoring devices that are being used at the wellhead.
That is true, but I'll tell you what strikes me quite candidly is that having had the opportunity to talk to T. Boone Pickens in the weekend following the rig explosion and having had Matt Simmons from the Ocean Energy Institute, formerly of Simmons and Company, on my show that first week after, and both of them, and I'm no expert. They're the experts. I'm the reporter. I went to those experts. I'm just some guy at MSNBC, and I said, what do you see when you look down there? And they say that, and they told me, and they said it on this show, and they said it to anybody else who would ask them quite candidly, that the flow rate was meaningfully higher. Anyway, it's for another day. If you look at our ability to contain the oil right now, we know we can't cap the well, but my goodness me, can we do more to either put booms, drop a curtain, bring super tankers? Are we still deferring in some way as opposed to creating the overwhelming response, the NASA-level mission to the moon-level response that would appear to be obviously required to deal with a volcano of oil in the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, I think Tony Hayward made it very clear today that from BP's perspective, the only meaningful way now of stopping the flow is the two relief wells, which we all know.
That's not my question. I acknowledge that. Matt Simmons will tell you the relief well might not work and the oil could flow for the next 30 years.
Absolutely.
I think the capping of the well is a red herring. I believe containment is the #1 issue for that reason, and I feel like we've all been distracted, and the government and BP and others have all got all this false hope about capping the well at the expense of a legitimate containment strategy for the intermediate to long term. Am I wrong in that perception?
No, I flew over this area last week when we had our field hearing in Louisiana, Dylan. Until you're out over the water looking down at these plumes and you fly over the wellheads where the relief well and the original well are being collected, you have no idea the massive geographic area affected by this spill. So one of the things we know is that there is a significant effort underway. I think we need to be doing more, but there's also evidence that BP has not been paying close attention to some of the problems they're having with the boom they've already deployed to make it reach its maximum potential. So I think we've got a lot more to do.
So I guess to make it very simple, are there other things that we could be doing to better contain this oil? Because it looks like there are.
Yes, there are, but we've also got a lot of ships that aren't being utilized to their full capability, and I think that's on BP's shoulders. They're the ones who have the ultimate responsibility.
But I would argue nonsense. That's the Gulf of Mexico. We pay taxes to protect our borders. Our borders are clearly threatened from the volcano. There's a point where it's no longer BP's problem, even if it should be. And the U.S. military and or any other government agency, the Coast Guard, NASA, I don't care, needs to deal with the fact that we have an uncontained, uncapped oil spill and stop saying it's BP's responsibility, because obviously BP is either not capable or not properly motivated.
Well, I think we're going to have continuing conversations about how you deploy those resources, because the Coast Guard, when I was down there, was fully engaged and heavily committed. The military ships you're talking about, this is not what they're trained to do. We would have to make sure that they had the necessary resource to be brought into this type of relief
tankers. I mean, listen, I'm a reporter, like I said, so I don't presume a great expertise, but the conversations with people like Mr. Simmons, like people like Mr. Pickens and others suggest that at the very least we know the Louisiana offshore port is the only supertanker port in our country, and it is in the Gulf of Mexico. We know by definition there are empty supertankers leaving that port because that is where they dump their oil. Anyway, Representative Braley, a pleasure. Thanks for the conversation. I don't want to take too much of your time.
Thanks for having me.
Bruce Braley, out of Iowa, Vice Chairman on the subcommittee responsible for the hearing that you can see that continues to this very